So that's what I'm saying. The text is like an object. It's gonna change perspective based on where you're standing. I don't know.
Hello?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
I missed you, baby sweet. It was a day.
It was a day.
Please tell me you're seeing this too.
From Seattle, we're Drinking the Movies. I'm Taylor Baker.
And I'm Michael Clausen.
Welcome back to Drinking the Movies. We're talking about some old movies today. How old are these movies?
Do you hear that, Michael?
What do you hear?
Nothing. That's how old these movies are. They're silent movies.
Well played, well played.
100 years ago, this year, these films apparently were released. I honestly didn't do my homework. I don't know when the shooting schedule was for these. I don't know when they were technically distributed or where, what country they went wide in. But these are listed in Letterboxd and IMDb and broadly as 1921 films. So
we go by IMDb here on Drinking the Movies.
Unless we're referencing Letterboxd, I honestly couldn't tell you. But we do reference a website and we don't double check it because we're empirical and we're never wrong because we never check to see if we're wrong. That's how we do it. But
Word.
I had postulated to you that I would like to, now that we're really getting into some film history years, do some reflections, as long as the podcast runs once a year of 3 titles from 100 years ago, just to kind of see what the history of cinema looks like at scale. And we're starting with 1921 because it's 2021.
Good year for film.
Yeah, I thought we were describing wine. Good year.
Yeah, I am right there with you. I like returning to the roots every once in a while. I think it's fun and refreshing to go back to the foundations periodically.
Yeah. I think before we get started on this episode, I did just want to talk to you broadly. We haven't done our first impressions yet. We'll get to that. But just at a larger level, February 1918. Mean anything to you?
No.
It's the start of the Spanish flu.
Interesting. Okay.
H1N1. Up to 100 million dead.
Whoa.
Ended April 1920. The average, I believe, is 50 million agreed upon deaths, with a maximum of 100 million and a minimum of 17 million. That tells you how hard it was to tell. And remember, this is coming off of the end of the First World War. I think that it's important to frame that, not only for a discussion today, but for, just a look at this word that I know you love. I know you love this word, but it's important to know the zeitgeist of 1921. There's a bigger word than zeitgeist that is, very scholarly and rarely used. It's called the Weltgeist. And the Weltgeist is this thing that you can't really judge. You can only talk about it kind of ethereally and make homage to it. And it's made up of all the zeitgeists, and it's made up of all the future, the ghosts of the future and what possibilities there are, the things in the past. And I think that when we look at these films from the 1920s, and specifically 1921, it's very apparent that the specter of death is a large specter on the thoughts of the people of that day and the artists of that day.
I like it. Important to put things in context.
And we are in the midst of our own much less dangerous than the Spanish flu coronavirus, not nearly 100 million dead. But we are going through our own thing 100 years later, kind of in context with that. And I think it is interesting to frame the conversation in the circumstance of what these artists were speaking to. Also notably, this is a point in time where the screenplay for The Phantom Carriage was co-written by writer Selma Lagerlöf. 1909, she was the first female to ever win the Nobel Prize for Literature. 1909.
Interesting.
And, it's very rarely that we get to discuss films in which the first woman to ever win an award in that subject wrote on or directed or anything like that. So I did just want to bring that up before we get going.
I like it. Good background. Appreciate it.
All right, should we do first impressions and just kind of throw this whole thing on its head before we get back to the depressing, bleak Orphans of the Storm?
Yeah, these are not silent movies, as people might have guessed.
Yes, these are first impressions of films that are coming out.
Let's do it.
It'll stop. One day it'll go quiet.
I don't imagine that anyone goes in for a robbery if they're not in some kind of desperation.
I've been at this a while now, and it's no secret what my face looks like.
Get on the ground! The one thing about robbing banks is you're mostly robbing women, so the last thing you want to be is rude. Ma'am, it's nothing personal.
All right, we just watched the trailer for Cherry from the Russo brothers starring Tom Holland. What do you think of this one?
Well, I mean, to think about it, you have to kind of frame it. You know, the Russo brothers are most famous for kind of stewarding one of the greatest cinematic franchises of all time.
One of the greatest?
Dan Harmon's Community.
Oh, good one. Okay. Nicely played.
Hey.
Nice.
But, you know, they also did something, I think, with Disney, was it? Marvel, maybe? I forget.
Something like that.
Tom Holland is Aquaman, is that right? So Cherry. Russo brothers, Marvel Cinematic Universe. They've been playing around with no stakes for a long time. They've made, heroes who don't die feel like they have stakes. And that's really hard. But what I'm interested about in this film is this is a human with human stakes. This reminded me a little bit of Jarhead, which I watched when I was in high school, and I wanted a war film, and I was very disappointed because it was not, Saving Private Ryan or Black Hawk Down. It was very boring. And now that I'm older, I'm actually interested in the boring side of it. It's also a bank robbery film. And I'm actually really interested to see the Russo brothers play with real stakes and real characters that are humans in the human real world, and try to play with American characters going through American problems. This is actually kind of exactly what I wanted to see from someone who went and made a bunch of money and now gets to launch their own studio with the first look deal. Is I want to see you try to tell a human story that's down to level, that has those things that you always repeat, which is like, where's the human, where's the stakes? And this actually has that. So I'm really interested in this. I don't think I'm going to love it. I don't think it's going to be my top 10. But I'm probably going to respond pretty positively to it. And I'm very interested to see this version of Tom Holland. How about you?
I actually don't think the chances are great that I'll check this one out. I don't know why. It feels very commercial. I don't know why I watched this trailer. It just feels more like a product to me than just cinematic art. It feels
he just calls
feels
it
very
content.
commercial. That is accurate. It does very much feel like content. I don't know. There's kind of this mix of sentimentality and self-awareness, right? He's talking to us,
narrating from the other side of death. Probably.
Yeah, I don't know that appeals to me right off the bat. That kind of feels like a trope lifted like from a comic book movie. Like I just now got around to Birds of Prey, which I know they did not do, but I don't know. This doesn't feel that human to me, actually. I completely understand what you're saying about it coming down to earth, quite literally almost, after doing the comic book movies. But in terms of it being something that I think will likely speak to me, I don't know. I wouldn't put big money on it.
I would also not put money on it speaking to me, but rather like this being an interesting first step in broadening their oeuvre.
Yeah, for sure. But I don't know. There are plenty of other things that I think I'm more interested in than seeing the Russo brothers, do something other than a comic book movie.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure Hong Sang-soo has another 2012 film that's just now getting an American release that we could prioritize.
The Woman Who Ran. I'm waiting for it. It's already on my top 10 for this year.
All right. Well, let's take a pivot from the Russo brothers' Cherry and go into Pelé, the Netflix documentary film.
Sempre me procuram para ver se posso apoiar lado ou outro.
E no meio daquilo tudo, um oásis de esperança, que foi a Copa de 70.
Naquele momento, Eu não queria ser Pelé.
I don't think anywhere in the world there's been an atmosphere quite like this.
Mas o Brasil é o meu país. Significa tudo para mim.
Pelé foi tudo.
Acho que o grande presente que você ganha na vitória não é a joia, né? É o alívio mesmo.
All right, Michael, that was the trailer for the Netflix documentary Pelé. What are your thoughts?
Well, sports documentaries are not the first kind of movies that I go to on any given night. That said, if I'm going to watch one, I think soccer is actually one of the sports that I am more inclined to check out. And I know zero about Pelé. I think I'll probably learn something should I decide to do it. I think the archival footage looks pretty great. I think it's really just clean, kind of impressive looking footage. I think it looks cool. I think it'll just be a matter of mood for me, to be honest, on any given night. If I decide that I want to learn more about Pelé, I could kind of go either way on this one. What about you?
Yeah, I think I'd echo that a little bit less heartily. I don't think you did, but I watched Diego Maradona previously. Was that last year? I forget which year it was my top documentary. The years are kind of blending, especially post-Sundance here in my brain. But the way that Asif Kapadia had edited Diego Maradona and introduced the context of him as a soccer player, both as kind of the representation of an entire nation on a soccer team, but also as this this martyr. Ostensibly, it was very, very interesting how he framed it, and it's one of the rare documentaries that makes me interested in who this person was out and what they had to go through as a human, due to local circumstance outside of the field. And I don't think I'm going to care about Pelé's life outside the field, to be honest. I understand that he's the hero of Brazil, and Brazil was going through a hard time or whatever, but I mean, I'm honestly not that interested in like Muhammad Ali. You know, like I like him. I like a lot of the things he said. I think he's a good person, but I'm not that interested in his historical resonance on America because there's so many other representatives, and it's such a large country, and there's so many ideas percolating. Maradona was interesting because it was such a specific small region that he was speaking to. I think Brazil is a little bit one of those larger regions where Pelé is going to say, you know, I said things that I didn't mean because they told me to. And I just don't know that I'm that interested in that story. I'll learn something, just like you said, and that's why I'm interested in it. But the footage and the editing looks fine. It doesn't look like it's going to move me and change the way that I think about the world. And at some level, that's always what I'm looking for in a documentary, is that amount of resonance to me as the viewer.
Yeah, honestly, with docs like this that are about really specific subjects, especially people or sports players, I kind of like to let other people check it out first and let them report back, especially like cinephiles who are not into sports. And if they give me the thumbs up, well, then I know, okay, it might be of interest, but it's not the one that I'm necessarily, barging down the door to check out.
I'm probably going to prioritize this behind the Seattle Mariners one that Peter Labuza and Hewlett have loved.
I've heard
that I
things,
didn't have time for.
Definitely.
It's very, very long. But let's stop talking about contemporary, boring pieces of cinema, and let's talk about silent film.
Let's do it.
Orphans of the Storm, Michael. To quote Arrested Development, that's why you always leave a note.
Good quote, good quote. This is definitely the longest of the 3 silent movies we watched. This is a...
Did it feel like the longest? It sure did.
Really
listener.
interesting. This is a good 2.5 hours of silent cinema, baby.
And you read the title card or the dialogue card, and then you're done reading it, and then it goes 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And now we're back to the scene. Now we're back to the title card. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And that got so brutal.
Was not moving at breakneck speed for you, huh?
Not in the slightest.
Yeah, actually, I did find this one to be one of the more entertaining of the 3 movies we watched, even at a good 2.5 hours. This is D.W. Griffith.
It definitely had the most people.
It did. A lot of people. Big cast. You have Lillian Gish and her sister, Dorothy Gish, playing sisters within the movie.
The last film that they did together, as I understand it.
Oh, interesting.
Silent film stars. I'm sure that many of our listeners know of the Gish sisters and how they were silent era film stars. You know, everyone knows that. People just walk around on the sidewalks talking about it.
Yeah. I think I should maybe say at the outset that I don't know about you, but I don't really apply some of the same criteria, that I apply to modern movies when I watch this kind of thing. Specifically, like, I reward subtlety when I watch a movie from 2020. Not so much. That is not as much of a concern for me when I'm watching this kind of thing.
It's not as much of a concern, but it does get exhaustive. Like, there's a certain point. I think. Sorry, we're already gonna jump movies. I think it was Destiny where she walks in and is talking to someone in the house, and in that same room is the person she's going to react to very plainly. She's in line of sight. She's been looking for this person, whatever. And then her eyes actually look directly at them. And it's this giant 10-second reaction shot. And I try not to, like, downgrade silent film mannerisms, but, like, that one just, it did not work for me.
Pushed the limit for you.
Yeah. And so when those moments happen in this film, there's some of them. They got a little bit outrageous. I think before we go too far, could you pull up a photo you took of one of the cards? Just read it for the listeners. This is the only piece of, out of all the films we watched, this is the film and the moments where we fell most in line, I think.
Yeah, that's right. So this is Orphans of the Wind. This is set during the French Revolution. Orphans of the Storm, excuse me. This is set during the French Revolution, just before it erupts, and during the eruption and the following Reign of Terror. Robespierre is one of the figures involved in the movement, and one of the title cards we were amused by is Robespierre, the original pussyfooter, a splendid regulator of other people's morals and affairs. So yeah, I bring up the comment about subtlety specifically with this film because we're literally getting title cards like this one where Griffith is quite literally
expressing his view.
Oh, 100%. Like if you can't get down with that, like right off the bat, like you're gonna have a bad time.
Oh, it doesn't shift. So if you don't like that, you're not gonna like it.
True. But I think the craft is kind of incredible to me and really sort of, it feels very foundational.
It's epic.
Yeah. And I guess what really kind of blew me away is just, how well it pairs the micro and the macro within its narrative. We have these two sisters, the Gish sisters, who become separated right as the French Revolution erupts. They're in Paris. And I think the balance the movie strikes between intimacy and the epic is something we absolutely take for granted in big movies today. I think that's like kind of incredible, actually, how well that the movie pulls that off. One of my bigger takeaways, I guess.
It feels like a foundational film. It feels large and epic. I told you it's like watching Silent Peterloo. And I meant that facetiously with complete sincerity. You know, like, not only do I mean that, even though that it's in many ways different than Peterloo and plot and supposings and all sorts of things, it's this giant period piece. There's full-scale war. There's full-scale crowds, and there's absurdities like a very clearly plastic head on a pike being moved up and down in the background, and you think, okay, I saw it. And then you see it for like another minute, and you're like, okay, you're really hamming this one up. And the scale, like you said, of intimacy versus the scale of disapproval with the government, it's just really interesting because it just feels, once again, foundational. I can't think of something earlier than this that pulls this off eloquently. And I mean that sincerely. I think it's eloquent. I think that through a combination of not being edited for my peculiarities and being outside of the time in which the primary way of speaking with one another was through letter via courier, it's really easy to overlook, you know, how communicative this was of people at this time and perhaps sentiment in America.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's a pretty suspenseful movie, especially when he's like literally telling you to like prepare for something via title cards. Like, it builds to this big climax where the revolution commences and the beheadings follow. Like, I think there's like lots of content to be entertained by in this movie. I think it's pretty vividly depicted. Like, I like that, you know, you're getting this very clear sense of his view of the aristocracy and how decadent they are. And like one of those early scenes where they're having a big party and, you know, you get those kind of master shots that show the lavishness of it, but then the close-ups of the food and the costumes. Like, I think that this is really kind of painterly storytelling in its depiction of the riches of the upper class and then the struggles of the underclass. Yeah.
I think it does do a better job of the underclass visuals, like inside the first house where the Gish sisters are before she convinces her to go to Paris. I do think that those intimacy shots of the inside of buildings are actually really, really well executed. I don't think anything feels quite so historically moving. I mean, we watched other films that kind of take place at the same exact period in time in which they're shot almost, or aren't too far outside of it. Whereas this is very clearly a historical piece, having a historical conversation framed through an American filmmaker. And the way that he pulls off those internal shots, I mean, it's not something I really noticed until we're talking about it, but that's one of the things that I'm not going to forget. You could bring this film up, and that's probably one of the first things I'll think of besides the Gish sisters and learning that the guillotine is female and French.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The shots of Gish in particular are often quite portrait-like to me, especially, I mean, it's funny how he seems to almost like know how to shoot Lillian Gish, the main girl, better than the other girl, the blind girl, and just how she seems to be glowing in some of those portraits. I don't know. I just think there's some magical stuff there.
Do you think that was purposeful? Because like the main can see and the other one can't see?
Oh, I hadn't thought of it that way. I honestly was thinking more about the fact that I think he worked more with Lillian Gish in like The Wind and Broken Blossoms. So I thought like he maybe just had a greater affinity for her, but it certainly is possible that maybe he is just quite literally looking more or reflecting something about their conditions.
Yeah. So I don't know the proper terms here, and that's going to stem through all the 1920s films that we're talking about. But there's an adjustment to the aperture in the aspect ratio in all of these films. And it's really, really nuanced in every single one. There's less of it here, but if it's not the aperture itself, there's a cloth, there's a piece of metal, there's an object that they're placing over the lens of the camera to adjust the view of the camera so that you're only capturing a certain thing. And then it will pull out, pull up, pull off. Corners will come back in. We'll talk about this a lot more when we get to Destiny and the Phantom Carriage. But the way that this is pulled off in these films, all of them, it is so astounding and so moving and personal to the story that I can't believe I actually had a really hard time watching how effective it was, that we just don't do that anymore. Whatever's happening here. We mess around with aspect ratio all day. All day we mess around with aspect ratio. But we don't just put our hands over the front of the camera, essentially, and adjust your view field so that you're only focused on the kiss right now and then pull up. I think some Disney cartoons still did that when we were growing up. Maybe Lady and the Tramp had some moments like that. But I can't think of film doing this now. And I think that it's just such a unique flourish to the form that really informs their careful thoughtfulness towards the storytelling.
Yeah, that actually, I know exactly what you're talking about, and I don't know exactly what the word is for it either, but I remember seeing those and actually thinking of the film we watched for a festival last year, which was Labyrinth of Cinema, Obayashi, who's doing some things in a very fanciful, colorful, brilliant kind of way that I very much appreciated. Where you're just seeing kind of a cutout of what presumably is the image at large. It's just a circle within the larger square rectangle.
Well, maybe he did do that. Maybe you're right.
That was one example I could think of. But yeah, not something you see a lot anymore. And I agree. It does. It is pretty effective in drawing your eye towards something to really emphasize something. It's a really unique kind of form of punctuation.
But it's all that. But it tells me how thought through the choices of the film are in a way that shifting aspect ratios just doesn't do. I love Nolan, and his aspect ratio shifts probably move me the most if Damien Chazelle's don't recently in First Man. But I mean, most of the aspect ratio shifts are they're interesting choices, but they don't tell me that you really have a voice of how the story needs to be seen in quite the way that those choices are made in these films, all of them. And I think that maybe that's the thing that I was most flabbergasted by out of all of these 1921 films, is that particular flourish to the form.
Yeah, I remember it most in this film, Orphans of the Wind.
Interesting. I remember it most
coincidentally.
in Destiny and the Phantom Carriage.
Really?
Yeah, I remember moments in both where I was particularly moved, more so than here, but I think that just speaks to maybe our personal interaction with the films.
Yeah. I mean, I would actually, I think, be somewhat confident suggesting this to somebody who hadn't seen a silent movie before, because I thought it did have quite a bit of suspense and forward momentum. And actually a little bit less so with something like Destiny. I don't know if it sounds like you maybe did not feel the same way.
I felt the opposite way, which is why I think that's interesting. I don't know that either of us is right. That's the thing about this. I don't get a sense that there's really a right thing. I do think that if I was going to come down in the middle of our voices, I think the Phantom Carriage might be the most approachable for cinephiles.
I think the atmosphere of that one and Destiny have some kind of built-in appeal, right? Something that's not scary by today's standards, but that is just in that vein, has some kind of built-in
but it's also referenced, right?
For sure.
The Ballad of Buster Scruggs directly references the Phantom Carriage. And then it has that really interesting Spectre I don't even know the right form there, where you're double layering your film to create the Spectre moment multiple times. But the score, I think, is what comes down to my decision making more so than anything else on all of these films. And to be honest, The Orphans of the Storm has my least favorite orchestral. I did not love it. I think it made interesting choices, particularly with the maraca that they scrape on. But its pacing was not really original. It kept referencing itself. It kept recycling its own sounds, and it didn't really use its tone to build towards something constantly swelling. And I think that more than any other film, The Phantom Carriage did do that, which is why I found that more propulsive, because the sound was cueing me in. And here I didn't feel like the sound had nearly as much to speak to. After the first 40 minutes, I'd heard every sound that I was going to hear.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree. Phantom Carriage, but far and away, has the best score of the bunch. It feels like that one's maybe just been, like, newly done or something like that. I don't know
think
that
we
I can...
saw, I saw at the end of the Criterion version that I watched that it had been restored from 2 different negatives in 1975. So it's possible that they rescored it then.
Yeah, I mean, it just sounds so much, like, fuller, richer, just plain newer than Orphans of the Storm. I have no idea, but it just sounds like they were done decades apart to me.
I agree. That I noticed that too. Yeah, I personally don't have that much more to say about Orphans of the Storm. Is there anything you want to walk me through or down or
not walk through. I mean, to me, it just feels like the blockbuster of the three. This has action, this has intimacy, there's romance here. Like, this is the more like the fullest picture of the three in a way.
A bit of a Moses moment, right? With, being royalty and not being royalty.
Yeah, just kind of the ancestor to the kind of like modern historical blockbuster. I think this is like, to me, it's kind of astounding. Where you can watch some silent movies and they feel a lot of them can feel a little trivial, and I think this just seems like one that is very easy to trace the roots of big movie making today too. Yeah, let's move on.
So before we do, I agree. The thing for me is being the archaeologist that spends 2.5 hours dusting those roots is a lot less fun than dusting the roots of these other ones for me.
Fair enough.
On to Destiny.
Destiny is from Fritz Lang.
Mm-hmm. Famously the director of M and Metropolis.
Which I would say I vastly prefer both of those over Destiny. What about you?
I haven't seen M.
Okay.
And I don't know about Metropolis. I think Metropolis is definitely more influential, but because Metropolis was, I believe, shot 8 years later. Is that right?
Don't know. Top of my head.
This is as early of Fritz as I've ever seen, and the expressionism. So first things first, I love the German opera as a genre. This speaks to the Germanic opera stories, of Siegfried and Der Ring der Nibelungen and the older Norse myths. All that stuff is kind of tied in here because it is a 6-verse or 6-act song. I don't remember exactly what the term is that they use in the film. Their Spectre of Death is a little bit more harrowingly older and weary. He's different than the Phantom Carriage. They both speak very similarly to that death that I was referencing earlier. I don't really know. I like so many of the choices as a person that it spoke to me because I was already interested in those art forms.
Yeah, I mean, there there are aspects of the visual language that I very much respond to. I mean, there are things like the night sky and some of the dark scenes are like, you know, painted or something like that, and they look incredible. But, you know, we have this frame story. We meet a young couple, boyfriend passes away. The girl gets an opportunity when she meets Death himself to like rescue him by intervening.
She gets 3 chances, and if she succeeds in any of the 3, then he will cut her the deal. And this is visualized by 3 candles. Mm-hmm. That's the thing. It's the expressionism of the story visually with the Great Shadow. Just constantly doing that I just love that stuff.
And I agree. I think like the frame story, I think, has the imagery I like best. The just nature of the beast is that it's episodic by definition, and I don't think that does much for like just narrative flow for me.
I would agree. It gets chunky.
I honestly like don't even really know what happened in the first chapter. I did not follow that very well. I kind of like
like the first of the 3 chapters in the middle. Okay.
Right.
Okay.
I like that I like the change of locations. We start in the Middle East. We wind up in Asia. I think I like that one the best.
Yeah, Asia has the most like 2D shadow on the wall.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm willing to concede that I may have just not followed it well. But it felt to me like there was just clarity that I was looking for and not finding.
For sure,
I could not get into the mechanics of this.
You end up going, well, wait, which one is she? Because you're trying to track who she's saving, and you're like, which one is she in here? I can't tell, because when they're doing the Arab one, where they're all the women have to wear a face covering, you literally can't tell which one she is until she's handing a dagger to someone to stab.
Yeah.
The person that she wants. And I mean, since we're talking about the entire film, she fails every single time. Right? Yeah. And we watch the visualization of that. And that's what I love about Lang's expressionism is he finds a way to frame the reality of the story into a small, permanent image that people can see. And I don't think Orphans of the Storm did that. I don't think it had small moments where you can expressionistically tell me the entire story in an image. And that's what's interesting about The Phantom Carriage with its clock. That's what's interesting about this film with its candles and its constant coming back to kind of the flame. And eventually, after she fails all these times, she strikes a deal with Death, who is a very Germanic-looking figure, to trade a soul for her boyfriend, essentially. And she goes to kind of the neighborhood elderly flop house. Mm-hmm. And everyone's talking about how they hate themselves and how living is a wearisome task and they're exhausted. She asks them which one will trade your soul for, which one of you will give me your soul, and they all run upstairs. Yeah, and it's this great moment of fear. I'm never gonna forget kind of the comedicness of it. And when they do so, the slowest one knocks over a candle. Once again, boom, we're back into the expressionism of the flame and the candle. This thing that we've been referencing earlier. That's something that I didn't get from D.W. Griffith's Orphans of the Storm. I think that he had an interesting allegory to the guillotine and how he was framing that constantly as femininity, knowing that we're coming off of this with H1N1, speaking to that death thing. But the flame here, I had so much to grapple with. And everyone leaves the house as it catches on fire, and including her, and they all leave except for a baby. She goes in, rescues the baby. Death comes. She makes the choice to not give the baby to Death, lowers him out the window, and then joins her beloved in the afterlife. It's a very basic story, but I love that opera. I love that saga.
Yeah, I wish I just felt more continuity with it. I mean, I agree. I think this is more visually striking movie, right? Like, Griffith is very clearly not interested in expressionism. And I agree the images are more striking in Destiny. And it's in a way, it's more like amusing one for me from a contemporary standpoint. Just the idea that she's saying to these folks, hey, you're about dead. Why don't you just go ahead and throw in the towel and give me those years? And the first guy's like, get out of here, and kicks her out and closes his window. I also like how in the third story in Asia, we see like a magician, and he gets a letter, and the like essence of the letter from the emperor is like, I'm bored, come entertain me. Oh, and by the way, if you don't entertain me, I'm gonna cut your head off. And then you get this great reaction shot. Maybe I don't know. I was just on the outside looking in on this one. I think I'm completely with you in the visual appeal of expressionism just in general. I don't know that this is the best narrative that it's been applied to for me.
I would agree. And it's because I like the form of the saga that I'm like, okay, this is not only something I'm deeply familiar with Germanic sagas, but it's just something that I passively like. So even if you do a bad saga, the amount of sagas I see in cinema are so little that just seeing one makes me happy. So, you know, that can definitely boost its number. But building on that familiarity, I will say we totally subverted the first act, essentially. And what you've been saying is the third act is actually the fifth act out of the 6 saga, song, whatever you want to call it. Mm-hmm. And in the first act, Death comes to town as a man and tries to buy a plot of land for the expansion for the cemetery. And through negligence of public planning and politicians, they end up approving it. And that leads to these consequences, ostensibly. And I will say that is the one similarity outside of the specter of death and groups of people dying is political incompetence from D.W. Griffith to this. There is a small tangential correlation in these 1921 films that is criticizing politics at 2 very, very, very different levels. One is in France. One is in Destiny is in Germany, right? And then the Phantom Carriage is going to be in Sweden, I believe. So we're going to 3 different European countries, even though one of these is directed by an American director. And those 2, the German one and the French film, are both criticizing the power structure of politics, 100 years ago. Some things don't change.
Yeah. I'm with you there. My mind was just instinctively making more connections between Destiny and the Phantom Carriage, but I think that is a totally valid connection between Orphans of the Wind and Destiny. In terms of the things I was drawing between Destiny and Phantom Carriage is partly just like how remarkably different the representation of death is compared to how we think of it today, and how there is a very eerie imagery in Destiny as well as Phantom Carriage, obviously, but it's partly just about like how exhausting the afterlife is in both of these movies. Like both of these guys, maybe even especially the guy in Destiny, just looks so depleted. He looks like he is literally drained of his life in the most literal sense of the word. And while it's a much more tragic kind of depiction of death than I think we often get in modern cinema. Which I thought was striking.
Yeah, and I mean, that's building back into my kind of opening statement. And, these are films made by people that didn't die during a kind of a large death event for humanity. And our minds, our philosophies, our religions, our expressions of art, our thoughtfulness, our everything was going toward trying to pick up and move on and make sense of the fact that all these people we know just died. Not just in World War I, but after H1N1, the Spanish flu, for, almost 2 years. And I think that specter of death, kind of this double exposure death, it's kind of what a lot of people described seen phantoms and ghosts as in that late 1920s through 1960s. And I do question whether or not, people that had grief and that type of thing were then informed by the visuals from this type of a specter of death and just kind of made the stories in their head make sense like that, because there is something deeper to the poetry that particularly Destiny and the Phantom Carriage have to say about the specter of death not being someone who wants to take your soul, but someone who has to show up.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want to take your soul. They have to show up. They're just as burdened and overwhelmed by this process as you are. And I think that reflects the common folk of they're coming to terms with these family members and friends being dead, and they're looking around, and it's not like someone wanted to die. Someone just died.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, I don't have much more to add to it. It's, more thoughts on Destiny, or should we switch to Phantom Carriage?
Favorite scene, Destiny.
Boy, do I? What is my favorite scene? It's probably stuff from the frame story. I know there are 5 parts, but in my head, I have like the 3 episodes and then like frame story essentially, and it's probably some of the shots where he first walks her into the room with the candles that each represent a life. I think that's maybe the most effective kind of visual storytelling there. What about you?
I'm gonna cheat. I have 2. The close-up of the candles all burnt down with the middle candle going out, and Death standing outside the wall of his new fortified enclosure. And all these living villagers come up and say, how do I get in? Where's the gate? He drives them all back by saying, you can't see the gate. Which is this great foreshadow. Because we still don't know how to see the gate. And then we see that only the double exposed dead souls can get through.
And that's a good segue to Phantom Carriage.
The Phantom Carriage, my favorite film out of the 3 we watched. This has my favorite score, has my favorite pacing. Every time I was done reading a title card, it only went one and then it would change. Those cards, very propulsive, all these side characters, but you never have a question about who's who like you did in the previous film we were just talking about. Where is she, the girl who's supposed to be saving these 3 men, right? You always know what's going on. There's some amusing ways of reading Swedish and English on the nurses' outfits and things that definitely informed some laughs. Just anecdotally, now it was kind of a fun watch, and framing it against all that with some of the expressionism of the clock and the gorgeousness of watching these landscapes have a Phantom Carriage roll through.
Yeah, the momentum you're describing surprises me. I do think it's a very gripping movie, but describing it that way is just interesting to me because it's the one that so relies on flashbacks. Like it's all told through flashbacks. We move forward by going backwards. And I think it's quite famously known for like the complexity of those flashbacks and how they're not even quite in order, which I don't think I realized at first glance.
Right, but what's A to B? From beginning to end, what's the story? The story is who died before midnight last.
Yeah,
and that is such an easy thing for me to map.
The whole moral of the movie, I think, is readily apparent from almost like the first couple scenes. So even if it takes a winding path to get there, I think you know where the finish line is.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, just knowing that you don't want to be the last soul to die, and then watching people become the last soul to die. I mean, that is so, it's not harrowing, but it's pretty dang close.
Yeah, I mean, it has a hook, you know, in a very concise, eerie hook that the other two movies I don't think do in quite the same way.
And the best score.
I try to, I love the score. I try not to applaud the score too much, since, I don't even know if the score's changed so much with Silence that, I don't know if what this has to do with, or I don't know how close to this is to the original anymore.
That's true, but, right, that bespeaks a deeper conversation of, is the piece of art that you watched, or is it the piece of art that you will never have a chance to see?
Well, I mean, I can consider both the ideas in my mind at once. I love the score, I'll say that, but, you know, I also am simultaneously trying to think about what Showstrom did, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah. I just make that comment because I don't know what to do myself.
Yeah.
It's like, do I try to map out what it was like to watch this with a live orchestra that played different in every country probably, or do I just let it be what it is to me now and love it for that? Because I mean, I really don't know what to do with some of these pre-1928, 1930 films that didn't actually go around with records playing on that loop system. You know, they literally would go out with a live orchestra, or they would go out with like a music box. I think there was like a wind-up music box for some of the major ones.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you know, depending on which version you watch, you're going to get a different score anyways. There's two different ones on Criterion. One's by a more contemporary experimental group, which I'm sure is great. That's how I saw Nosferatu, was with, contemporary stuff. Yeah, there's definitely something to be said for just describing and understanding experiences versus the text itself. I do think, we can do both. We can talk about experiences and the thing that doesn't change from viewing to viewing, I guess. But yeah, I mean, I think this has some of the most memorable imagery for me. I like a lot of the stuff in Destiny for sure, but that early sequence in Phantom Carriage where we get this short little montage that's more just like a day in the life of Death's carriage driver, because we're seeing him collect the souls that are unrelated to the plot. He goes and picks up the guy who's in the ocean and a guy who commits suicide himself.
Isn't it?
It's not long after we meet him, I don't think.
Oh, I thought that was in the middle.
Yeah, that one reminded me a lot of the Night of the Hunter and the underwater scenes there.
When he actually goes and grabs him from down below. 100%.
Yeah, totally.
The top, though, I'd never seen anything like that when the carriage is on the waves. I thought you were talking about, I'd never seen anything like that. Nothing touching that.
It's pretty good. That's definitely one of my favorite shots. Yeah, and on this score that I did listen to, it's interesting that, sometimes it works as sound design in a way. There are a couple moments where it feels like you're hearing the wheels just screech or something like that, and that adds to that idea that it is just that much. It is that torturous to drive this thing day after day, because it would just be piercing your ears. I do think that's one element of the score that I liked. Well, that was probably not part of the original experience. Yeah. What else struck you as interesting?
I think that this has the most interesting, repetitive, stagnant object. The first film, I would say, Orphans of the Storm, has a singular object as well that is the fulcrum to it. That is the guillotine. That is the representation of death. That is the representation of freedom. It's the representation of a lot of things in that film. Political movement, all that stuff. Destiny, the candles, they're telling time, they're telling chances, they're telling outcome, they're telling the story themselves. They're showing you a visual clue to the story. I actually fall most in love with the Roman numeral backlit clock here. It clues us in. It's constantly referenced, and we know every time we see it, we do the math, and we're like, how close are we to this person being the last person to die at midnight? Whoever we just saw, because whoever we just saw, we're now seeing what time it is for them, and they're close to a death situation. And that just kept the propulsiveness for me. Kept, when you're wondering who's going to die and there's a ticking clock, it's hard not to be propelled.
Yeah, I could be mistaken, but I swear when I read this, when I was just refreshing my memory and looking at the Wikipedia page, it said that it was released on New Year's Day in 1921, I guess.
That's foolish.
That is so foolish. What a missed marketing opportunity, right? My thought exactly. Like, how do you not release this on New Year's Eve?
I mean, I'm really glad because we got to watch it.
True.
As a 1921 film.
Fair point. I hadn't thought of that.
Why wouldn't you put it out then?
What a missed opportunity. Man, I don't know anything about Swedish marketing in the 20s, but man, by a day, you really could have had something.
Wait, how would that work? Yeah, you could have released it in Sweden on the first of the new year and still released it on the West Coast in America in time for us to panic.
Totally. Yeah, 100%. Sending telegrams across the world about this myth. Yeah.
Turn on Windows Swap and watch people panic.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, outside of that, I was astounded by how they dressed the horses, I think. That's one of the things that it's just this small flourish in costume design. I think Orphans of the Storm undoubtedly has the most interesting, most extraneous costume design. But it's that little thing of putting these, some sort of a shawl that has these white-ish bones that when the film is double exposed end up making it look like they have bones, and the space in between where those bones are has no presence of film content. Was really interesting because I don't believe that they trimmed that. It didn't look like it was trimmed white. It looked like it was just something that was made to have that refractiveness.
Yeah, 100%. When you see the original driver, George, I think the difference in posture between this dude and the representation of Death and Destiny, who is tall and standing completely upright. This guy, like when he's driving the hearse, or not a hearse, I feel like it's a hearse, the carriage, in those first few scenes, like he's so hunched, and you just sense that like every bump that carriage is going over is just going to be painful. And again, that idea that it is just agony to drive this thing, I think is even just in how this dude looks, hunched over the reins. Yeah. Striking.
This has my favorite editing out of all the films. I think each one I was very taken by how well edited they were, but none of which really spoke to me with the choices they made in editing as this film. There's these great moments where they're playing off of the fact that they're silent, openly just kind of mocking the viewer into not knowing what's happening. Most memorably for me is the scene in which she sews his coat. And the nurse goes to get the nurse that sewed it. And he walks towards the door while she's talking to the girl. And you have no idea why he's going to leave. What are they saying? Are they saying something terribly offensive about him? Like, why is he approaching this door? And then she comes out and he starts tearing it apart. And you're just... what type of communication did these people have? Like, were these nurses evil? What were they saying? And then you're informed by that title card afterward. Just really great choices to edit the dialogue after the scene so that you go through all these different personal emotions trying to frame the context. And then they just kind of hit you in the mouth with a hammer and say, no, it's none of the things that you thought in your head.
Yeah. Yeah. I kind of lost my train of thought, but I know exactly the scene you're talking about. And the coat itself is even kind of a nice object, right?
Great object.
Yeah. I think I had missed some of the significance of the coat and how, it was likely contaminated with whatever disease he was carrying.
Consumption.
Consumption. Yeah, exactly. Until afterwards, when I was refreshing my memory of the film and came across that certainly sort of reframes, like, how I'm looking at the coat in certain shots and based on who's handling it even. Another good prop.
Right, and she wanted to mend it and he wouldn't let her mend it. And the consequence of that, story-wise, is she gets the consumption as well and comes to pass. And that's kind of our big swelling finale climax. I was the most moved by this one. I'm the most interested in rewatching this one in the future. I'm most likely to turn this score on independently. I'm most interested in seeing his filmography out of the 3 that we saw. I actually want to see all of them, but if I had to pick one, I am most interested in his because I had zero familiarity, and every choice he made, I felt like, oh, you made a better choice than I could have ever told you to at like every turn. So whenever you're kind of confronted with an artist that you have no familiarity with that's making all the right choices in your perspective, I think you just end up drawn to him, and that's how I feel about him.
Yeah, it's certainly the one that I find most interesting for its like narrative complexity. You know, just the whole fact that we start off with questions that we don't have the answers to. Why does she want this David Holm guy so bad when he looks terrible right shortly after we meet him?
We should mention that's the director.
Yeah, Victor Sjostrom plays the main character essentially in David Holm. And, you know, I always kind of think about noir as being, you know, partly influenced by German expressionism, and this is expressionistic in a way, but I also, like, kind of in my head was connecting this narratively with noir just because of the flashback structure, you know, just such a noir trope.
In the underwater death, I mean, such a noir trope.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, lots of interesting stuff.
What was your favorite of her silent films?
It's a really hard question. I just find each of these interesting in really different ways. I would probably say Phantom Carriage. I think that'd be the one I most likely rewatch, or Orphans of the Storm. Probably just not Destiny. I think I like those two better than Destiny. What about you?
Phantom Carriage is my favorite. Then I'd go Destiny, Orphans of the Storm. Interested in all these filmmakers. Before we close out, the hardest question: what's your favorite scene?
I really do like the one I already talked about, that opening sequence. But we haven't even talked about like one of the more famous scenes of the movie, which is David Holm chopping down a door in his home to get to his wife.
True. I texted you right after the film was over for me, because I had no idea that informed it. So why don't you give the viewers a breakdown of what occurred?
Yeah, that is just shocking to me. It feels almost like a shot for shot remake that we see in The Shining of Jack Nicholson famously chopping down the door to get to the wife and kid. It's crazy to me that like that is one of the most infamous scenes in The Shining, but I don't feel like it is commonly known that it is borrowed from Phantom Carriage. I certainly had no idea. I don't think I have ever heard any mention of that.
I'd never heard any mention of it, and I when I sent you the message, I was serious, but I was also joking because I still haven't looked up if it's true. But even if it's not true, it's true. Like, it's just so apparent that is the wooden door. The woman's on the other side of it. She's shaking. She's filled with fright. She's frenetically filled with fright. You know, it has all the same beats and moments. The specter of death is in the building. Mm-hmm. All this stuff is going on. And yeah, I mean, I've seen The Shining probably 3 times in theaters now. And I feel like I know a lot of influences to it. And I've watched whatever that Room documentary was. Oh, yeah. And never, not once has this ever come up. I think that I've heard the Phantom Carriage being referenced for some, particularly the Hunchback of Notre Dame and the clock tower or something, how they shoot some of the clocks in other films, and the use of the carriage and the specter of kind of a shrugging death I've heard, but never this super hyper violent attack toward a wife.
Yeah, it definitely feels like there are thematic connections to be made too. Just, these are stories about a small family that's torn apart by the actions of the father. Mm-hmm. He's quite literally diseased in Phantom Carriage, and he has the possibility of infecting them, whereas he is more psychologically violent in The Shining, or psychologically troubled, whatever
Right, but like in The Shining, remember the ghosts from the past and the picture and Jack Nicholson in that? Like, I don't know, there's just so much more that this may have influenced. And
For sure.
I almost wonder if Kubrick just like didn't tell anyone because he only wanted people that knew to know, and like that might be why. Because I mean, I know this is one that's watched, but I don't know that it's one that I hear discussed often.
Yeah, I would agree. But what is your favorite scene?
Oh, that's right. Dang it. I thought we were getting distracted. Oh, boy. My favorite scene... I'm just going to cheat. It's both the underwater scene, where, you know, you've built up watching it go on the waves. The waves have this white foam, so it's very hard to see the carriage in front of it. So you really have to look, and that pulls you in and it pulls you in. Then all of a sudden you're at a totally different scene, and it takes you a minute to adjust and realize you're underwater, and that's kelp. And wait, is the Spectre of Death in there? And he is, and he's pulling the soul up. It's incredibly memorable and very, very interesting filmmaking that went on to inform Hitchcock and everybody else. Night of the Hunter, all that stuff. And just the shot of a black night surrounding a backlit clock counting down. Nothing about this film is as memorable as a clock counting down in the middle of the night and knowing that whoever dies last is cursed for a year.
And on that note, we are out of time for today.
Run! Go! Get to the chopper!
We have to go.
I'm coming with you.
That was brilliant.
You're the best and we love you!
And that's another one in the can.